quickly, yeah, so I'm Sal. I work at Resolve. Resolve does like B2B payment processing type complex advanced payment slash SaaS stuff for invoicing. It's a every company I work with feels like a completely new problem to build around and to design around. And I think like, any of you looking to get more into design, you should understand every problem is 100% unique. You're very rarely going to run into something that's exactly what you've done before. So you'll have to think outside the box. And what I'm going to present to you today is a project I worked on before I joined Resolve at a company called Vave. And for me, it was a truly pretty novel experience. And it's relatively technical, but it's really about the lessons I learned from it and like the ways I approach solving it that I think are more important. Although, I'm happy to answer more technical questions as we get to go through it, and hope you guys enjoy it.
And Sal, is it okay if we ask you questions while you're presenting?
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
All right, so feel free to join in, gang.
Cool. All right. So generally, Vave is a company that was relatively new. Its founder broke off or was a PhD at Stanford in electrical engineering, and I worked on ultrasound primarily. So his idea was that can we basically take ultrasound, bring it up to modern standards today, where we are looking at truly wireless, truly like seamless flows that use consumer influence design. And I would say that like you can kind of summarize the Vave portable ultrasound as a combined hardware mobile product that helps users make on-the-spot diagnoses and treatment decisions without bulky and traditional ultrasound devices. Or as I like to kind of colloquially say, AKA how I tried to make medical imaging as fun as Snapchat, at least back in 2017. So the device was basically meant to work on like to give you some constraints here, work on Android and iOS phones and tablets. And my objective was like flexibility, consumer style design, and simplicity without sacrificing technical strength of the product. And I'd say like if any of you guys and gals who work at like smaller companies, you should know that like this is the advantage of working on early stage products and getting to design is you get to have a lot of influence over a lot of these decision making early on, and you can define the framework and the rules and the values that you try to express in what you create. So take that as an opportunity. Don't think of it as in it's a chore. Instead, it's an opportunity to like really push the envelope as best you can. So basically, you can think of it as the ultrasound space, like a lot of med tech stuff, is like very outdated. We're talking about like extremely advanced technological implementations on the hardware side, but the user experience is almost always like super stagnant and super dated because we're talking about hospitals purchasing like thousands of units. These are like complex firmware, can't be updated like wirelessly all the time. It's almost easier to just have something waterproof and like with big old buttons that anyone can push because it's easier to teach and it's what people are used to working in a hospital environment. So basically, Vave decided to try to take a very different approach. As a small company with like, obviously like limited funding, limited resources, it was worth it for us to invest in being a little riskier and to try to build something that was truly wireless. There had been maybe like one or two other wireless ultrasound devices in the market, but nothing had really captured anyone's heart. And we were basically at a perfect point because everyone now had extremely powerful computers in their pocket, right? I would say even like a few years before this may not have really been possible. But this was around the time the iPhone 10 was coming out, and screen space was becoming better, touchscreen interactions were becoming better, and wireless technology was becoming better. And when I came in, basically, my goal was, can I leverage modern mobile app design with our hardware to change point of care ultrasound? So we're talking in clinical environments when a doctor is actually faced with a patient in front of them and they need to do diagnostic imaging, they need to be able to document some workflows and do this in a way while they're interacting with the patient. So it's not restricted purely to like image capture. To give you this little primer about ultrasound, I mean, ultrasound has been around for about 50 years. And fundamentally, I would say with a few minor exceptions, it hasn't really changed. It uses like piezoelectric crystals, they turn kinetic energy into electrical energy. You literally have to have contact area with a patient. There's a lot of heavy processing and noise issues and pattern recognition that has to go on. There's battery life issues if it's wireless. And if you've had any sort of ultrasound or seen one, you've probably seen this device over here. Something similar to that. If you're lucky, you've maybe seen that. And if you're really lucky, you might have seen something like this, which is like pretty cutting edge. But you can see that there's still cables involved. There's still a lot of like manual work involved. And for that reason, a lot of what I had to design had to be around legacy interactions that you've probably never seen before. I don't think you would ever intuitively think these days to like develop image capture that way. When I approach designing something like this, I tend to think about like, what are the constraints that I can build around? And for me, that's like, there's two pieces to that. There's knowing your levers and knowing your constraints. When I figure out the levers that I have, what can I actually manipulate to create the best experience? I'm giving myself a tool set to help define my values and like where I can start building something from the ground up. I was also lucky a little bit at Vave that I was able to have a tight relationship with the dev team. So that meant like I could literally pixel push on the front end myself if I wanted to. And the leadership was on the same page as me to some extent because they were so hardware focused. And I'd say a lot of the engineering resources were heavier towards the firmware and the hardware engineering side of it of actually functional ultrasound. We were given a lot of free rein on the software side to really push the envelope. Hardware is hard to revolutionize, but like software can continuously improve. And so that's where you want to think about these kinds of things. If you're ever working on a combined intersectional product like this, what are the levers that you have to actually push things forward? And the second lesson, I think that the second part of that, the constraint part of that, I would say is like absolutely vital, I think, to creativity. I think I probably naively early in my design career thought I could solve everything all the time and solutions should be open-ended. It should be an open box. That's not, I think, realistic when you think about actually solving problems in the real world. I think you need to think about things like, if it's a mobile app, it has to be responsive. What device does it work on? Is there a framework, a development framework we could use that actually works well, that helps us cut some corners? And then ultimately, like, am I looking to, like, a simple decision would be, am I looking to optimize for image capture in and of itself as a technical workflow, or am I looking to create an excitement or feeling around this? What are my values? And I consider values constraints that I try to build in. I carry that to where I'm at Resolve today, where at my current company, I kind of get to make decisions around, are we a more traditional financial company or are we a more exciting software Silicon Valley company? And it helps me make decisions on how I want the interface to go forward, how I want our branding to go forward, and the kind of patterns I want to carry through all of my design. And then I think to pair that, when you actually really start working, you need to know two additional things, which is really like, number one, know your audience. We decided at Vave that we were 100% catering our design and products to make a splash. And that meant designing around promising new medical students, young programs, and cutting edge institutions like our partnership with Stanford. That gave me a little bit of leeway because that meant I could be a little more experimental. That's a nice break to have in design. I think you don't always get that, especially if you're coming in with the legacy product. The people we were talking to were quite comfortable using their own or department given smartphones and carrying around ultrasounds like a new stethoscope. They all used photography apps like it was nothing. And sexy interfaces with complex interactions were second nature. So I think that sets a good framework for the kind of people we were aiming for. And then we were hoping to maybe backfill in for the rest over time. And lastly, like, you have to just acknowledge in design that there's not just one solution that's the best. It's the unfortunate truth. There are a million ways to design something, and without like an infinite amount of research, you won't ever find like a global best. So it's better to just dive into problems, find your local maximum, and work on it from there. And for all you know, you might be able to find ways to like jump as you get more resources to like make fundamental changes. But a well implemented design that is around what you know is better than better than a million designs that don't really quite get there because you're trying to search for the perfect fit. And so for me, that meant defining and sticking to an approach and a workflow. So for me, that was like a workflow sandwich. For me, it's like clean and like medical record inspired clinical workflows, sandwiching a modern mobile consumer image capture experience. Cool. I'll promise I'll get to like sexier images and stuff like that after this, but I just want to set this framework a little bit. There are three pieces to the way point of care ultrasound has to work, especially in a wireless environment. There's the first step, a single, ideally step that's maybe like an onboarding step, which you do have to do multiple times, but ideally it's a little more automated based on the hardware software interaction, but it's pairing your ultrasound device with your mobile app. Ultrasound is high data transfer. It needs a very strong connection. That means Bluetooth in and of itself does not satisfy that need. So we actually had to build a wireless, basically a wireless network built out of the hardware device in and of itself that the phone would connect to. and you would actually use that Wi-Fi network to transfer data, which is a very novel thing for me. I had never really done anything like that before. But that meant that we kind of had to skirt a lot of the rules around or skirt through the rules and all the hoops we had to jump through in like iOS and Android to be able to build out this connection that was robust enough. Then you've got this core image capture, which has two pieces to it. You've got the capturing images in and of itself, and then reviewing and annotating. And in my mind, based on like modern apps that I've looked at, I don't think these things are separate and truly defined things that are that you would say like one happens and then the other happens and that's it. People are used to doing both in one environment, and they consistently loop through these two. And ultimately, like the last piece of the sandwich, last piece of the bread is really managing and completing that clinical workflow and being able to like submit it to the cloud. And once I've got these three pieces, that means I can design moments of excitement around these cycles. For me, those are three, because they're three very different experiences, I'm allowed to have different feelings around those experiences, and I'm allowed to build up different feelings around those experiences. I don't need to be consistent through all of them, as long as they are internally consistent. For me at Vave, a lot of it was like iteration. So starting with like small patterns that I can expand across the entire product. So I started with like, very technical, just, hey, here's how the data transfer, here's how the model works, here's how we connect pieces, to like earlier iterations, which were more focused around, let's start this clinical workflow, and like get them through the functional pieces needed to set everything up. And then ultimately like building out a much more robust set of screens, which are like full interaction mockups around every single button press and how the interface gets changed. So if we kind of look at like the way you connect devices, basically like I took a lot of inspiration from existing patterns that were already out there. The best example being like, how do you already connect to a Wi-Fi network on your phone? For the most part, a lot of it centered around being able to see what was available, see ones you paired to before, see what potential opportunity there is there naming, and is there battery life available to it? And it kind of like melded a little bit in my mind with the idea of, if I'm connecting to this wireless network anyways, I want to go one step further and actually be able to like jump into exams right away. Because if I'm a physician in a clinical environment and I need to get started, I'm not just image capturing. I am also like in an exam with the patient in front of me, and I need to like make a lot of decisions around like what kind of presets, what am I scanning, how quickly do I start it? Am I starting a full exam or just a small, quick exam? And are there any probe settings I need to change? And one of the benefits of having a Wi-Fi network was, in fact, multiple devices can connect to a single Wi-Fi network. So that meant we could have a physician controlling the ultrasound capture itself on a phone, while at the same time having a large screen TV or something also projecting that same image. So we were able to create a model with like a little bit of a network, so that multiple people could assess these things, like in a medical teaching environment. That would be perfect. Students could look at a screen while a physician was doing a diagnostic image. And the second piece is that really like image capture UI riddle, which is, how do you allow for the maximum functions in a structured and predictable interface? And it has to be accessible in different sizes. And like after a bunch of iteration, I did develop patterns around what I thought were the best ways to approach. And for me, that was like patterns of three. For me, that was, if I'm holding a phone and I start with a phone first as opposed to a tablet or anything, and design around that, how do I structure an interface where everything's accessible within a range here? We have information that's important to you, but you have maximum screen space. And luckily we were at a time now where we could start to leverage the fact that screens now have full real estate from bottom to top. We didn't have a home button at the bottom and cut off at the bottom and top. And then on top of it, can I layer touch interactions to deal with things such as zooming, moving images around, being able to like change focuses. I think we can talk a little bit about the way an ultrasound interface works, maybe in a minute, because I think that's an interesting one, and why this problem is like a little more complex than it seems at first. And you can sort of see how I needed to like deal with degrading in different situations. You can imagine if you were holding a wireless device in one hand that had to be up against a patient, and you were holding a tablet in another hand, you're not in fact holding it from the bottom anymore. Most likely you're holding it from the side. So by dealing with orientations on a larger screen, I had to think about and do a lot of like user testing to determine like what's the best way to degrade this experience, so that touch interface, the key elements of the touch interface had to be accessible. I think that presented like a number of complex front end development problems as well as UI problems, but ultimately it felt successful, and I think it was successful, creating one app code base that was able to work in all these different situations. Cool. For me, a lot of these patterns were based on common interactions that people had seen before. If we're already leveraging the tools that they keep in their pocket, why would we diverge from those patterns? It's basically free design work that's already been given to us. So, I mean, you guys probably recognize a lot of these, but like the left one would be Snapchat, the middle one would be, I think it was VSCO, and then the right one would just be the iOS one. And you can see patterns in the way that things are structured. And if I'm trying to approach from a consumer perspective, why would I diverge too far from these patterns? But strangely enough, none of our competitors had really approached this problem from these perspectives anyways. So that immediately allowed us to have like a little bit of a unique place in our space.
Sal, why do you think they didn't look at this that way? Were they trying to mimic an old machine, or what were they trying to do?
I think that's basically what it is. So the way a lot of ultrasound machines are purchased is they're purchased on large contracts with a large number of machines by administrators. They're not usually purchased by people on the ground actually functionally using these devices. And in a lot of ways, our business model was trying to upend that a little bit, right? We were looking to create something that someone could purchase on an individual basis at a price point that was around the cost of a mobile phone anyways. So that means individuals could purchase it for private practices, to carry with them, to use on trips. Essentially you could give one to everyone on either like a subscription basis or a full purchase basis. That is completely different from the way that large hospital systems work. And they have legacy relationships that they want to maintain established with large companies. And those companies have never invested in I think, good front end design. They've almost always invested in just purely strong hardware design. And I think this is probably, like, for me, one of the most challenging but most rewarding aspects of this product, which was really consumer influence capture. So the way ultrasound kind of works is that you've got this live image going on. Traditionally, there's a big old green button that's a freeze button. You hit that button, it stops the image. And from that point, you can kind of make decisions around what you want to do. You can add text, you can drag measured distances, you can mark things to see flow inwards versus outwards. That's what this color, what the color imaging is for. But having all those buttons available, I think if I remember back from one of the old screens, we're talking about like 30 to 40 buttons on a large screen. If I establish a clear interface pattern, one of my basic personal rules I like in my interfaces is that I don't like things to move around. I don't like to change the number of buttons. If ideally, if I have to, I'd rather have an asymmetrical design where buttons stay in the same place and perhaps disappear, but I would prefer not to have things changing, because ultimately, especially in a clinical environment or a fast-paced environment, people's muscle memory counts for a lot. They're going to go back to those places to click. And for me, that meant this central button. I took some of the swiping for changing modes at the bottom from places like Instagram's capture acquisition, but a 3-part button to essentially freeze the image, take an instant photo, or take a recording. So I kind of compromised a little bit. I said, this seems like a really silly way to do image capture, to have to freeze something, deal with it, and then maybe save it. I'm going to try to create a amalgam of both worlds where I could just instantly hit this button and immediately save an image right away to my roll if I'm working quickly in a fast-paced environment, or I could save a short video by holding it down, or I could freeze it and be given a choice to save a single frame or the last like 60 or so frames. And in much the same way, I needed to be able to toggle back and forth between the image capture and ultimately like a view of images, which I'll show you in a second. So that's why on the right side, I expanded from 3, actually through multiple iterations, into 5, where I now was able to view, to jump very quickly into my gallery of images afterwards. And then the left side was for an additional annotation stuff, to basically view things. And then to pull from Snapchat, I used a lot of, once you froze, immediately adding options for annotations in the top. For me, that felt like a relatively novel space that would structure well on different screen sizes without impeding the image itself. The kind of like touch interactions we had on the image itself were things such as pinching and zooming, adjusting focus, focal depth, so that you could see images at different depths within somebody's body. But the idea was that we want to leverage those, but what's more important is probably purely the image capture, because you can imagine if you've got a handheld device, you're actually physically manipulating it around, like, for example, someone's liver or around someone's kidney or something. So you can actually point it and change the depth a little bit on your own manually through some skill. So that's kind of where we were at, is that it's a compromise between, here's what the basic things we want to give you on the mobile app to capture very quickly, and then here's where your skill ties into this to actually be able to like achieve the perfect image. And that toggles into our gallery, which I pull from a
Hey,
lot of
actually,
like,
Sal, can I ask you a question on the previous page?
yeah,
So when you
absolutely.
look at something like this, how much of this was something that you basically planned out, and how much of this came from observing people working with earlier versions of your system, or how much of it
Mhm.
came from presenting them mock-ups? Like, where did you learn
Yeah.
the most?
Mhm.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so when I did join, they did have an existing version that had some minor testing. I would say for the most part, even our engineers and the people doing the development on a daily basis, when I would watch them interact with it early on, it did not feel like an actual like fast, quick, uh, well-designed interface, I would say. It felt like I have a functional piece of hardware and I have a functional application and I can push this button to capture an image. That's what it felt like. It felt stilted and a little bit, uh, the experience felt like they were going through the motions without actually understanding what it felt like in a clinical environment. I did initially, actually what I did was I took, I had a big whiteboard. I literally laid out like 50 different screens with the markers and like rectangles and everything. And I laid out. I basically created like a chart, a little spreadsheet for me of like all the different button combinations and how I could potentially pare those down into the minimum. And then I just started layering out, playing with how these buttons could be laid out on the screen. So for me, that was an initial approach I could take. Once I kind of had a few ideas for a framework, I actually took those, created high fidelity mockups, and then actually made an interactive mockup so that I could actually take it out and start playing with it in front of actual people. So I think maybe we'll mention it a little bit more later, but like the idea was that I actually had a 3D printed version of our hardware that I put weights in to imitate how heavy the device would be in one hand. I would put a dummy in front of them and I would give them a phone which had an interactive mockup on it and ask them to go through the motions of actually capturing things and see how awkward it was for them to move their fingers around. Were they able to actually manipulate buttons in a reasonable way? And could they do this one-handed? That was essentially like the limitation I set on what I was designing, was like, if it can be operated one hand, even if it's a little bit awkward, that would be ideal. That's the standard I want to live up to. And through like a bunch of iteration, a lot of it dealt with like started to deal into like basic visual design language as well. Like, how do I deal with iconography that expresses what I want to achieve without cluttering the entire space? And I think like, like all designers, we kind of dream a little bit and hope that everyone understands perfectly exactly what you're trying to get across through your buttons or through your layouts. But it's a little bit of a compromise and a little bit of a learning curve. So I had to accept that a little bit as I was doing a lot of testing. But I mean, the testing came out much more positive than I ever expected. And for that reason, I felt confident in the direction that I approached. And for me, that was centered around like a very clean pattern of 3 to 5 buttons that were laid out. Cool. And I think you can probably tell like this is not like something you've never seen before. A lot of this is taken from dealing with your gallery in general. I think the complications started to come in when it became how do we tie this into a clinical workflow? So because we need a framework for actually capturing during a clinical exam and handing off, one image capture session kind of got wrapped up into an entire exam where we actually asked the doctor to potentially add patient names, add potential notes, and those could be uploaded into folders. And this was actually like ended up being one of our biggest selling points at the time, especially to medical schools, because what this meant was actually students could examine patients with just a phone and this device. They could have a whole drawer full of these devices. They could create a portfolio of the things they were intended to capture, and then they could share those and upload those and actually be kind of graded on these. It basically set up a situation where now somebody is not just capturing single images, but somebody's actually packaging something in a way that they can actually submit for like long-term usage and build up a portfolio over their time to like look back at and have reviewed. And then in much the same way, we with additional folders and everything, we were able to allow educators to give them examples back. And I think that that ended up being like a much more vital part of the process long term in our development than I probably initially anticipated. So this was like a little bit of an extension. I focused so much on the image capture initially, but like this ended up becoming, I think, a shining point in the app.
So was this basically a technique to get this device into every medical school?
Absolutely, that was our plan. That was our business strategy and our marketing strategy. If we're not going to completely replace like large ultrasound devices that have been invested in that were $50,000 in ERs and in other places, we might as well start when they're young and get them excited about something that we think is better. And if they think it's better, then why would they want to go back? That's kind of what we hoped for. And hopefully setting it at a price point low enough to where they felt it was approachable. Cool. And
I
probably
have a
like
question.
oh yeah.
Sorry, Sal. To keep bragging on this point. Did you, I don't know how much user feedback on this level you might have been exposed to, but did you get a sense that people wanted to use your sort of interface or the way you organize things and like submitted stuff to graders for more than just like their ultrasound work?
I would say, I think to some extent they did. It was a little bit of satisfying two pieces. So one was that some people at hospitals were required to literally submit their images for documentation. So they needed a way to export. As opposed to simply just exporting individual images, though, they did need to be securely transferred and like added to a patient's file. We can't just have images just kind of like emailed, which is essentially what they were doing beforehand. That was like highly insecure. I think for the most part, the focus was purely on image acquisition here and appending that to an existing like electronic medical record file. I don't think we were looking to like fully replace their documentation otherwise. I could imagine a situation though where we could probably extend this further. Especially, I do know like a number of medical record systems actually encourage physicians to take pictures of issues they see or record issues they see and actually have those as well sync directly into their medical record, if that answers your question. Or
Yeah, that mostly answers my question. There's like a slight follow-up, which is like you built all this kind of like real-time image annotating technology basically. And was there any idea that you could use this outside of just the ultrasound application? More like you could take a picture of someone's skin or whatever?
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, Tom, but I actually think that's probably like potentially a relevant use case. Especially, I mean, the dream is, and obviously everyone always talked about it when we were working on it, building that tricorder, right? The Star Trek tricorder that does all the health things for you. I think that would be a reasonable extension. I actually think that would be relatively easy to implement. I could see that being the case. That's a smart way to extend this. Yeah.
And those are my questions. Thanks.
And I'd probably say like the weirdest part for me, and maybe, I don't know, it's relatively rare these days within San Francisco to see as much of this, but like industrial design is probably like one of the most weird things to ever have to do. Working with industrial designers is very different. They're very, very like regimented. They're very structured. They're very detail oriented. And I think it was one of the most enjoyable aspects in a lot of ways, because it meant that I could think about like, I have this thing I want to build. I feel like my app is reasonably pretty, but like, I would love for the device itself to be sexy. I would love for the device itself to have a theme. And so like a lot of the pushing and a lot of like the discussions I had were around like, how do we position literally the physicality of this object and how it fits in the user experience. And so for me, a lot of the things I was trying to express were like, let's not go too hard line. Let's go softer. We want to find a balance. A lot of our branding, which maybe I'll talk about in a sec, was centered around not being overwhelming to new users. And instead, we wanted it to felt like approachable to both physicians and patients. So soft curves, soft colors, using multiple materials, which allowed us to have like softer pieces against skin contact, which felt less cold, as well as heavier duty, better thermally insulated pieces where the battery is located, or things along those lines to prevent a lot of like the heat transmission directly in. It was actually like a very complex technical challenge to develop this device because we're talking like full computer processors plus developing its own internal Wi-Fi network, plus doing all this image processing, plus batteries in there, and being able to swap this out in an environment that is potentially not sterile. So there's a whole host of technical challenges I would definitely talk to anybody about if they were interested in, but like that's maybe a little out of the scope of this talk. And like I said, a lot of my testing was actually very, very formal. Because this was a fully approved device, a device that was aiming for full approval by the FDA, that meant our testing had to be recorded with actual formal outside testing companies that were able to vouch for both the security and the accessibility of the product. And a lot of that came from the initial ones of 3D printed mockups with a fully interactive mockup of the mobile app, all the way through further testing where we would actually have the user go through the entire experience end to end, despite how painful it could be, with no involvement from us. We would just ask them to do something and not tell them how to do it at all. And I would have to sit there in front of them and just try to be quiet and just let them struggle and hopefully learn from that experience. To basically pair and image capture and annotate and finish workflows 100% blindly, manipulating on dummies and using their preferred hand to use the app. That meant we ran into a lot of like little dead ends here and there. People would struggle. And especially, I don't know if you guys have done any intense like one-on-one user testing, but a lot of times people love to try to please you. That means they're going to try to like look for you for hints so that they can do the right thing and say the nicest things. I would say don't listen to them when they do that. Just, it is what it is. If they want to be that, they can be that, but be that clinical cool person. Just smile and just nod and let them keep trying.
Hey, Sal, could you speak a little bit to that when you're doing user testing? Since we're literally going to do that in about an hour for our first user, how do you mentally, or how do you take notes about what's going on? It sounds like there's a test where you talk to them and there's a test where you don't talk to them at all. Can you talk a little bit about like what's good and what's bad? What are you writing down? What are you thinking about? Do you have specific hypotheses you're trying to answer? You keep an open mind? Like, what are you doing?
So I think there's basically, I would say in my mind, there's two types of testing you can really approach here. So one is the more qualitative one where I'm looking for general guidance in seeing if there's general improvements and solutioning, basically. I'm looking for solutions here. And then there's the second kind of testing, which is looking for problems. And I think that the one looking for problems is arguably like the most important one to do long-term, because that's where you really start to see the limitations of the designs you've built. The first one, which is more qualitative, is around softer questions where you're trying to understand how do they work in their environment. Tell me about your experiences with other products. Tell me about how you've actually what are your limitations when you're actually in an environment? How much time do you spend on a clinical exam? Things along those lines. But when you're talking more quantitative testing, you're basically, what we would do is we would have a whole list of tasks that they would have to go through. We would basically, I think there were, if I remember right, there were 3 states. There was pass, there was like attempted, and then there was just completely failed. And that allowed us to basically score them based on how they did. And ultimately afterwards, at the end of the exam, we asked them questions to basically get a better idea as to how they felt themselves about each of those steps. So did they feel like they were able to get through that step by themselves? Did they feel confident in what they were able to do? And do they basically, do they think that this experience mimics what their expectations are? So that would be as detailed as here, you have this device, this piece of hardware. Here you have this mobile phone. Can you open the app and can you connect to this hardware, piece of external hardware? That's a pretty broad ask, and that's a lot of steps involved. And you are going to run into situations where people just don't know what to do. And a lot of that's based on previous knowledge. Have they done anything like this before or not? You will want to ask follow-up questions to understand these frameworks so you can understand what you can actually pull out of this for your own solutioning. But like, it's part of the experience. You're dealing with the diverse user base. You're going to run into people who just don't know what they're doing, and that's okay. That's part of the process. You learn from that.
And how many of these did you need to do before you were like, okay, I got it?
I think probably like, I think we did about every session for an iteration, we did about 10 to 20 physicians. And I think like long-term over the entire time, probably like 50 to 100, I think was the total number of physicians we generally cycled through. It was a little tougher because physicians tend to be very time constrained and it's hard to organize with them. So that's where those partnerships that you develop with like, with other companies, other organizations, and getting their buy-in is like really important, because they're willing to work with you if they feel like there's a little bit of like mutual relationship and benefit that they have going on. So I'd highly recommend for user testing, engage larger organizations while also going after individuals and leverage your personal relationships. It's not as perfect as like long-term, like when you really are talking full-scale consumer testing where you've got millions of users or whatever, but for developing a product that you think is functional and usable, and leveraging every little ounce you can get to get additional people to try it out is like absolutely worthwhile. You're going to get a lot of data out of it.
Mm.
Cool. And then ultimately, just for fun to tie it in, because every designer loves to talk about like actually working on like other sexier parts that aren't tested. It also meant an opportunity to think about like a little bit of the branding and the packaging and how these things tie together. And that meant like defining things like illustration styles, going for I chose like soft gradients, approachable colors. How do you enumerate complex things such as an image capture going to the cloud and then spreading all over the world to like other devices, which could be on any network? How do you show that like there's security involved? How do you show the data transfer between like an AI that's able to recognize, oh, and I guess I should maybe mention that I didn't talk about this at all in the talk. We actually had an AI component to this, which was, or I guess I should really say machine learning, which was able to recognize certain like body parts based on scanning to help with learning. I don't really have too much imagery for that, but maybe I can chat about it or answer any questions about that if anyone's interested in it. But for the most part, it's showing the split up of data and how it flows so that people can anticipate what's going on, especially in a field like medicine where people are very sensitive to where patient information is going. Giving them a big picture in a friendly, approachable way is extremely important. Cool. And a lot of that kind of like helped determine a lot of like the branding choices I made, a lot of the explorations I made, ultimately like the logo we ended up settling on. Yeah, and overall, I think like, that's basically my quick little spiel as to how I help build like a mobile and wireless ultrasound. I'm open to any questions, whether it's about med tech, hardware, software design, design thinking, consumer versus technical design. Yeah.
So Sal, I had one question, which is when you're designing something that has to work. I mean, we chatted a little bit about this before. We're working for an audience where we think that there may be a culture gap between how they look at using apps, either in terms of what they currently do at work with their tools or age. How do you kind of look at that, and how do you work around that when you recognize it's happening?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. I think there's two pieces to it. So one is that like on one hand, I think everyone's desire is to come up with the best way to solve something with the latest technology. So it's not just the best way; it's the best way with the latest technology and the latest like interactions that you're used to using. And the other aspect to it is that there are existing patterns that are out there in the world that perhaps that market already is used to using. I'm of the opinion that finding some sort of happy medium between the both is usually a good intermediate step. That's one way to maybe approach it, is if you can support a lot of their previous patterns while also starting to introduce them to new patterns. I think that that's like a nice way to kind of transition people over to new ways of looking at it. I would say like an example would be coming back to here. In my opinion, and based on a lot of the testing I did, it was faster to simply hit a single button and capture an image directly if you were good enough with an ultrasound device. There was no reason to freeze, stop, cycle through frames, and then pick one and then save it externally. I think that's like a huge number of steps for something that's meant to be an immediate, fast situation. But for a lot of the older physicians we worked with, for a lot of the more traditional fields we worked with, they were looking to just stop and think for a little bit, because that's what they were used to, was hitting that big green button, having a bit of time to think about it, maybe cycle through frames. We gave them a bit of leeway by going ahead and saving like the previous 60 frames. So we gave them a buffer. And then we let them kind of feel it out and decide if they wanted to consistently keep saving using that method, or they wanted to kind of jump ahead. And what we found was like through long-term usage, actually a number of the physicians we work with would slowly switch over to other methods if they found it more effective in those situations. So one of our most common exams that a lot of our physicians would do would be liver lesion diagnostics. And so that meant for them, they knew exactly, the liver's relatively easy to find. The lesions are relatively easy to see. Our hardware was actually particularly good at noticing these. They would initially go through a lot of this workflow, and we're talking like freezing and waiting and then thinking about saving and then unfreezing and then freezing again, maybe thinking about annotating. This would be like a very long process. And you can imagine holding a piece of hardware with one hand and holding a mobile phone with the other hand. That adds up to a lot of time. The other thing to kind of like think about here is that for a lot of these people, handedness starts to matter. I personally, I'm right-handed. I use my mobile phone with my right hand, but you know what? If I'm gonna write something or manipulate a piece of hardware, I'm also gonna use my right hand. Well, I can't use the same hand for both. So in these testing situations, they either needed to learn how to use their offhand to hold a mobile device and manipulate it, or they needed to hold a piece of hardware in their offhand and learn how to manipulate it. And so for a lot of these people, that led to them wanting patterns that were simpler and more, let's say, continuous with what they'd seen before. But people learn really quickly, especially when they're in time-constrained environments, and especially this was one of the advantages of working with a lot of younger students in like med schools and stuff. They didn't have a lot of priming as to how ultrasound had to work. So they were willing to try new things and experiment a little bit more. And I think using those people as advocates is really good because that helps you determine what features could actually be novel, real improvements over the flow. But keeping those older users or maybe less experienced users who might need the older flow around is important as a baseline to see how they transition over time. If you can get them to repeatedly use your software, use your hardware. That's probably like the big lesson I would take away from that. Hopefully that's something you can apply at Sideline HD as well.
I have a question about reusable components. You talked a little bit about how you want to design patterns that can work across the entire platform you're building. How do you go about doing that? One, when maybe you're working on one problem and you want to find a solution to a specific problem and it needs to work for everything else, or even maybe a step further when you don't even know those other problems yet and you're building out something from start to finish. How can you create something that's reusable and isn't going to hurt you down the road when you realize that maybe it was the wrong decision?
That's a great question. There's a little bit of risk involved always when you do these things. For me, actually, this is not something that's unique to Vave. I've actually done this at Resolve as well. For me, a lot of that is anticipating and being the arbiter of a broader UX architecture. I think that's the way, I think that's like a relatively newer term, but I actually think it's probably the perfect way to describe it. Somebody has to be the one who steps forward and says, we can't make every feature and every solution 100% unique. They need to overlap in some capacity and reuse things. Otherwise, we are adding so much work down the line to maintain these things and to add any additional features. I think the key to being able to like build something architecturally that is sound and scalable is to probably define early on exactly what are the values that you're trying to espouse in what you're building, and can you compare that to any other products? I think like it's hard to just build these completely in a vacuum from scratch. So for me, a lot of that meant I broke this problem down into 3 pieces for my architecture, which was initial connecting workflows, image capture workflows, and ultimately like annotation and documentation workflows. Within the image capture in and of itself, for me, I generally like to write out a list of, I think like I maybe briefly mentioned, I try to write out as extreme of conceptual situations as I can think of interactions that somebody could deal with, to try to create some sort of like superset of situations where they might need overlapping interactions. That's probably a lot of words to describe. Basically that I look for every dead end that I think someone could run into, mostly within buttons and where they might need to actively be involved with something, and think about the minimum number of buttons, or I guess I should say that, yeah, the minimum number of buttons required to be able to successfully achieve what they want to achieve. So for me, that meant if I'm on a home screen here, where I have a live image, what are all the actions I would be able to take? Then I start thinking about, if I've frozen it, what are all the actions I'd be able to take? If I have started to annotate, what are all the actions I'd be able to take? And then I start to think about, okay, let's say for some, I have 3 buttons that they need in that situation. For some, they have 7 buttons they need in that situation. How do I start thinking outside that framework as to what they need at any one moment in terms of accessibility? So is it better to just create one component with all those buttons, or is it better to start thinking about splitting them up into separate buttons at this point and separate lists of actions that they can do? I think I don't know if there's really like a long-term way to really predict exactly how these things are going to develop over time. But I do think that like that iterative process of making these decisions and actually just laying them out and testing them out is a little bit of the painful grind that you have to go through to start making a lot of these patterns. So I mean, I'll say this to anybody looking to design something that's scalable, like best of luck. It's always a little bit of a pain, but you can do it. It's just a matter of just iterate through and accept the fact that you're going to have to think about long-term conceptual things. Maybe like an example where I could parallel that at Resolve is for us, we've got all these like workflows where we are trying to get people to send invoices to our software and do things with it. That could be as simple as a simple widget, right? That's one clear little flow. But we have customers to manage through our software. We have invoices to manage through our software. We have broad like our customer merchant accounts to deal with through our software. What are the commonalities again at a larger scale, just like I would compare here? What are the commonalities and actions they would need to take in all these scenarios? And how do I create a superset of an interface or an architecture that would satisfy all of those situations? And that's just a bit of a grind where you start listing out all the actions they would take on the pages, and you start thinking, what are the components that overlap between these? And how do I build a structure that uses those components in a robust way? Cool.
So if you had more time to design everything, do you think you would do things differently? Or like, where did you take the most shortcuts, do you think?
That's a good question. I would say probably the place that I took the most shortcuts near the end would be actually, and I kind of glossed over it a little bit, is how you deal with images that were already saved and captured. I think it becomes really important, especially when you're thinking through a time constrained situation where someone is doing things in a moment where they don't have time and their focus is distracted, to allow them to come back and actually take the time. In a lot of interviews with physicians, what I found was that, and this was not just true for image capture, this was true for the way they dealt with records in general, they would come back afterwards and finish filling out exams for patients. So when you go to the doctor and you talk to them, I guarantee you they're not 100% filling everything out right there. At least a good doctor really shouldn't be, because they're supposed to be looking at you and talking with you. If they can get to the point where they have all the data saved they need, then afterwards they go to their laptop and they go start working on it. So in my mind, that post-clinical flow is actually arguably the most important thing. I think everyone knows how to take a picture. That's not like the end of the world. You can take as many pictures as you want. Storage is not an issue these days with phones or with whatever. But that time afterwards, where you go and you analyze what's going on and you actually figure out what you want to do with it, is that's the thing you need to convince them to do, because that's where they start building up this terrible backlog of things that they don't even remember when they took it or what happened to it or where it went. If they don't take that incremental time every single time to start working through it and start annotating and cleaning all these images up and all this data they've acquired.